We've been speaking a lot about Pope Francis lately, and it's true that even before his famous interview, from the very beginning of his ministry, he was talking about the church asking the church to stop looking at itself and being concerned about itself and its own institutions and its own rules, and getting out there to the people, and especially to the poor. Of course, he took the name Francis, named after Francis of Assisi, who was called il poverello, the poor man, who dedicated himself to Lady Poverty, and whose feast we're celebrating this coming week. But it goes way back before him. Well, even Pope John Paul II. The most famous use of this parable, I think, in the past couple of decades was when he came to New York for the first time in 1979, I believe, and preached on this gospel. And he said, I think it was in Yankee Stadium, no less. He told us as Americans, precisely, he said, what about all the poor on your doorstep? Now, in your own country and around the world, you have to take responsibility for that. Since we have American exceptionalism, we have to be the watchdog of the whole world, well, maybe. But especially in terms of aid, in terms of caring about our brothers and sisters in this world. And this is, as I said last week too, the church is pounding this into us, because the gospel does. That's why we have it 2 weeks in a row. We have the same prophet, Amos, with the same, as you just heard, very stark and direct words. Couldn't be clearer. Which is why in the gospel today, it said they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. I mean, the prophets are perfectly clear, so there's no need for somebody to rise from the dead to remind them. It's there in front of their faces and ours. The primary message of the prophets, if you look at it, at all of them, is turn again to God, but do it especially by caring for the poor in the midst whom you are often oppressing, he reminded them, and not caring, as we see in the gospel today. As I quoted also last week, some of the things that Jesus says couldn't be clearer. His primary emphasis, one of his primary emphases was taking care of the poor. It shows on his ministry, healing, hobnobbing not with the wealthy or powerful, but with the poor and those in need. Saying it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. What could be starker and clearer language than that? It should make us terrified of being rich. Terrified. And what about the passage we have just before, again from the letter of Timothy, just before the passage we have now, today? It says we should be content with sufficiency. In other words, with a decent, dignified life. We didn't bring anything into the world, it says, and we don't bring anything out of it. You can't take it with you. He says those who want to be rich are falling into temptation and a trap. Foolish and destructive desires that have led people to perdition and ruin. Again, pretty strong language for a situation we need to avoid. And it adds this very famous line, desire for money is the root of all evil. Well, we can discuss that, but you certainly can't deny that it's pretty forceful and clear. But above all, the passage that most strikes me is when Jesus tells us what the last judgment's going to be. You know, we have the crib notes, you know, we have the exam before the exam, we have to see it before, and it says you're not going to be tested on whether you can recite the creed, but on whether you recognize Jesus in the least of his and our brothers and sisters. I was poor, I was hungry and thirsty, I was naked and a stranger, I was in prison in the hospital, and you visited me, or not. And there are some lines in the second reading today that strike very close to that. Were you able to recognize Christ? It says, God is immortal, invisible. No one has ever seen him. No one can ever see him. it says. So if we're looking to see God, you have to follow what St. John says in his letter. Don't go around saying that you love God. You can't say you love God whom you can't see if you don't love your brother or sister whom you can see. As clear as that. So that's what we have to bear in mind. There's this connection to our brothers and sisters, which is important. That's the treasure of life, this connection. And that's the way we should understand the symbolism of the gospel today. For better or worse, and mostly for worse, this imagery has been used throughout the centuries as if for some kind of literal presentation of heaven and hell. It's not literal. All these things, language itself, but especially religious language, and especially religious language about the next life, which you know nothing about by experience, it's all symbolic. But for that very reason, very profound. I mean, it's symbolic by the very fact that they speak about going to the netherworld, Hades. It uses the Greek word from Greek myth in the Greek gospel, Hades. They were in Hades. And the angels brought the poor man to the bosom of Abraham. Well, I mean, if that's not symbolic, just like the right hand of the Father. But the other language is symbolic too. So when it says that there's this great chasm established between the two poles of the netherworld, that's not something that's artificially created by God as a punishment, prevention. It's a symbol of the chasm and the abyss that the rich man established between him and his neighbor when he was alive. He created the chasm, not God. And that's true that we create our own hell the same way. God doesn't artificially create a hell that he throws sinners into. We create our own hells. Now we do. And the hell is that of isolation. The cynics would say, get rich as fast as you can and that's your security, then you're safe. Make your gates and your hedges and your fences as high as possible. And isolate yourself. And make your own hell. Plenty of examples of that. Because you cannot find happiness when you're separated from those in need, when you're not generous in pouring out what you freely, graciously receive. So he made that abyss. Similarly, the flames, all this imagery of the flames of hell, it's not some fire artificially created by God to, as one writer says, burn the behinds of those who are thrown into it. Again, symbolic. Symbolic of what? Of the energies, put it this way, the energies of the whole cosmos, the energies of the kingdom of God, which, if we're not in harmony with them, the fundamental law of the universe, which is not greed, but generosity and abundance, giving from the Trinity all down through creation, and that burns and sears and tortures us because we're not in harmony with it. Our bodies and souls, whatever of our being. And again, we are responsible for that. We make it to torture by not being in harmony with it, the fundamental law of the universe. So it's about connection. It's about discovering happiness, joy, our true identity, our final destiny, our connectedness with one another, with the universe itself, with God. And they all go together. You can't have one without the other two. And if you don't have one, you don't have the other two either. They all go together. Because you recognize Christ in the least of our brothers and sisters. So that's the true treasure. That's our true security. That's our true wealth. Being connected in the same torrent of generosity and gift that we receive at every moment from the whole universe and from God and from one another. global society which gives us so much of our own goods and all the riches of their traditions, which then we then can share and called to share with one another. That's the true treasure. The more you give, the more you have. The less you give, the less you have. Even what you think you'll have will be taken away, as Jesus says, because you can't take it with you. And if you look around at the way the world is today, you can't keep it for very long anyway. What you can keep for all eternity is love and compassion. So let's open our ears to the gospel, to the prophets. Let's open our hearts to one another. And we'll discover where the true wealth lies, both now and forever.